Okay, so in the next couple of lectures, I'm actually going to, it would have been one class period, but I'm going to break these up because I know listening to a lecture without any break, without any chance to comment, it gets a little old. So I was going to talk about egoism in one class period, but we'll actually break this up into two different recorded lectures. In one, I'll talk about one thing we might mean by egoism, and in another, I'll talk about another thing we might mean by egoism. But first, I think it's worth saying a little bit about why I'm even talking about egoism, and maybe to say a little bit roughly about what we mean by egoism. So, look, egoism is this idea that people, human beings, are or should be self interested. Selfish, maybe you might say. And if you think about it, it's pretty obvious why egoism is in conflict with morality as we normally think of it, or might even be a threat to morality as we normally think of it. It's pretty clear that the way we usually think about morality, the way we usually think about the right thing to do, it often asks us to give up things we want, or it asks us to do things we don't want to do. I'll give you an example, right? Imagine that you're walking along, no one else around, and you find a wallet. Maybe you're in a state park or something, but you find a wallet. You pick it up, you open it up, and there's $300 or $400 there. Let's say 400 will make it more, and we'll make it more tempting, right? So there's a pretty significant amount of cash there. Also, the person's ID is there. You could find this person pretty easily. Well, look, the thing that's in your self-interest, probably for most of us, unless you're a lot better off than I am, the thing that's in your self-interest would be to take that money out, throw it back on the ground. Maybe if you want to be really devious, take the money out, throw it in a trash can, right? Hide the crime. The thing that's the morally right thing to do, of course, look at the ID, go home, get on the internet, try to find this person, tell him or her, I have your wallet, you can come get it at this location, right? Not only are you not taking the money, you're going to spend a fair amount of your time, a fair amount of effort to find this person. That's also pretty clearly not in your self-interest. If you're like me, if you're like most people, you have things you would rather be doing than trying to hunt this person down and get their wallet back to them. So hopefully that gives you guys some sense of why there's a conflict, or why there might seem to be a conflict between morality and self-interest, between morality and egoism. Okay, so philosophers have this habit. Some people find it annoying. We have this habit of, when someone makes a claim, we'll often say, well, what do you mean by that? And look, I do realize this can be maybe not the most endearing characteristic philosophers have, but we have a good reason for it. We want to be clear on what we're talking about. You saw this with the Rachels. He wants to be clear on what we mean by cultural relativism. Well, when we talk about egoism, I think we should be very clear on what we're even talking about. And when someone throws out the term egoism, seems to me that they can mean two different things, two things that are in fact pretty different. The first thing they might mean is psychological egoism. And psychological egoism is a claim about how people actually act, how people actually are. On the other hand, they might mean ethical egoism. And ethical egoism is not a claim about how people are or what they actually do. It's a claim about what people should do. Psychological egoism says, well, people are often, maybe even always, selfish or self-interested. Ethical egoism doesn't make any claims about how people actually are. It makes a claim about how people should be. So hopefully that distinction's fairly clear to you guys. I mean, if you want to really focus on a word, psychological are ethical should, right? But, I mean, let me give you guys an example. And this isn't necessarily egoism, and it is kind of self-interest. Let me give you an example that'll hopefully make this a little clearer. Look, as a psychological claim, I might say, well, people tend not to think of the future. If people have extra money, they spend it today instead of saving it. That's how people actually are. That's what people tend to do. On the other hand, an ethical claim, I might say, well, people, when they have extra money, should save it for the future so they'll be secure. Look, difference between the claims. I can make one claim about how people actually usually act, what they usually actually do, and another claim about what they should do. So, psychological, claim about what people actually do, how they actually act. Ethical, a claim about what they should do or how they should act. We'll talk more today, well, not today, in just this lecture, we'll talk more about psychological egoism. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about ethical egoism. Okay, so psychological egoism. Well, actually, we're not done yet because, before we can even talk about psychological egoism, we still need to be clear on what we're talking about. And with psychological egoism, we can mean two different things. We might mean weak psychological egoism. And weak psychological egoism is a claim about how people often or maybe even usually act, what they usually or often do. Strong psychological egoism is something, as the name implies, much stronger. Strong psychological egoism doesn't just say, well, people are usually or even often self-interested. It says, well, they're always self-interested. Strong psychological egoism, you can even think of it as making this grand claim about human nature. It's not just that we're often self-interested. Human beings are set up in such a way that we can only act for self-interest. Only act for selfish reasons. Okay, so let's talk about the two of these. Let's talk about, two questions I want to ask with each of these forms of psychological egoism. Are they true? Or at the very least, are there good arguments for them? Is there good evidence to think they're true? And then, well, if they are true, is it interesting? If these forms of egoism were true, would it really be a threat to morality as we normally think of it? Let's start with weak psychological egoism. Well, in the first question I want to ask for weak psychological egoism, is it true? And look, I think, for me at least, and I think you guys will probably have the same reaction, for me, it's pretty clear that weak psychological egoism is almost certainly true, right? I mean, think of it this way, right? If you want to know why somebody did something, well, a lot of the time, some form of self-interest is a pretty good explanation, right? If I ask y'all why you were taking this class, most of you, maybe even all of you, would cite some kind of self-interested reason, right? I want to get my associate's degree in X because if I have it, I can do this career and I'll earn more money. I want to transfer to a four-year college and I want to take as many classes as possible at a community college so I can save money, not have to go in debt. That's self-interest, right? Or, look, a lot of other stuff people do. If I go get a cup of coffee, well, that's probably self-interest, right? I like the taste of coffee. Maybe I have a class to teach later. I don't want to be sleepy. Those are self-interested reasons. So, and I'm not going to bore you guys by talking on and on and on about all the evidence for weak psychological egoism because there is a lot of it. people often act for selfish reasons or self-interested reasons. So weak psychological egoism is true. But then the question is weak psychological egoism really interesting? Is there any conflict between morality as we normally think of it and weak psychological egoism? And the answer, I think, is no, there isn't, not at all. Look, morality says that we should sometimes give up what we want to do the right thing. Weak psychological egoism says that we are often or usually self-interested or selfish. Well, if you think about those two statements, there's really no conflict there, right? It's perfectly consistent to say with weak psychological egoism, well, sometimes we ought to give up on self-interest, and even if you make this claim that we usually act for self-interested reasons, you can say, well, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we act for selfless reasons, or at the very least, we should act for selfless reasons, and we can give up things when morality asks us to. Think of it this way, right? Most of the time in your day-to-day life, there's just no conflict between self-interest and morality. I mean, sometimes there are, in a big way, when you find a wallet with money in it, there's a conflict between self-interest and morality. But, when you sign up for this class or whatever, well, look, there's no conflict between what's in your self-interest, trying to get as many credits down as possible before you go to four-year university or getting your associate's degree. There's no conflict between that and morality, right? It's fairly rare. I mean, it's really memorable. It's really strong in our minds when there is a conflict between morality and self-interest. But it's fairly rare that there is, right? I want to get a cup of coffee because coffee's delicious. Well, there's no conflict between my self-interest, drinking this thing that I think is delicious, and morality. No moral reason I shouldn't get coffee. And for all that weak psychological egoism says, in those fairly rare cases where morality and self-interest conflict, for all that weak psychological egoism says, it's perfectly possible that we act for moral reasons. So weak psychological egoism, true or almost certainly true, very good evidence for it, but not really all that interesting and not really threatening to morality as we usually think of it. Well, strong psychological egoism is a different thing entirely. Strong psychological egoism would say, well, human nature is set up so that we can only act for selfish reasons, for self-interested reasons. And look, let's reverse the order of questions here. Is strong psychological egoism true? Is it threatening to morality as we usually think of it? And then, well, is there any good evidence for it? Is it likely to be true? Well, look, if strong psychological egoism were true, we would really have to rethink morality. We normally think morality tells us we should give up our self-interest, while strong psychological egoism is saying that's impossible. And I'll talk a lot more about this, especially when we get to Kant. This will be pretty important with Kant's moral theory. But there's a moral principle that should requires could. To say that we should do something, it has to be true that we could actually do it. It would make no sense at all to tell me that I should flap my arms and fly across the room, because I can't do that. Well, look, if strong psychological egoism's true, we literally could not act against our self-interest. And if morality told us we should act against our self-interest, it would be asking us to do something that's impossible. If strong psychological egoism is true, we couldn't do it, so it would make no sense to say we should do it. If strong psychological egoism's true, well, if we're going to ask people to do the right thing, we better give them self-interested reasons to do it. So strong psychological egoism, really interesting. We'd either have to let go of morality as we normally think of it, or we'd have to completely rethink it, give people selfish, self-interested reasons to do the right thing. But here's the question. Is there any good evidence that strong psychological egoism is true? And the answer is, I think, no, right? For strong psychological egoism to be true, it would have to always be true that we act from self-interest. It's not enough to show that people often act from self-interest or even that they usually do. You'd have to prove to me that they always act from self-interest. That's a really hard claim to prove. Not only is it a really hard claim to prove, there seems to be a lot of evidence against it. There's a lot of evidence where people act against what seems to be their self-interest. Think about this, right? If you guys know what the Congressional Medal of Honor is, it's the highest military honor the U.S. awards. And most people who get the Congressional Medal of Honor, well, the thing they do that gets them the Congressional Medal of Honor, the reason that they're awarded it, more often than not, it's something that's so brave that it gets them killed. And when they do it, they generally know it's going to get them killed. Something like jumping onto a live grenade, certain death to save the rest of the people in your unit. Well, if people ever do something like that, it's pretty clear that strong psychological egoism isn't true. Jumping onto a grenade at the cost of certain death, well, that's not in your self-interest, right? If people do that, strong psychological egoism says people always act for self-interested reasons, or even human nature is such that we can't help it. Well, if you can find me one case like that where someone acts contrary to self-interest, that shows that strong psychological egoism isn't true. Well, look, I think a lot of times people think strong psychological egoism is true because you can always tell me or tell a person a story where there's some selfish reason for what the person does. Look, if I really want to spend my $50 on myself, but I see that somebody else is really in trouble, they need it more than I do, and I give them my $50, you can always say, well, you just did that because you didn't want to feel guilty. You get this warm feeling from helping the person, and what's more, you didn't want to feel guilty, so it was selfish. Or, someone volunteers at a soup kitchen or whatever, maybe they have openly selfish reasons. Oh, I want to put this on a college application. I want to look good in my community. But even if they're just doing it out of the, quote, goodness of their heart, you might say, well, you just want to feel good about yourself. You just don't want to feel guilty when you see a homeless person. Well, I think two things we ought to notice, though. One, in some cases, take my case of someone who hops on a live grenade to save the rest of the people in their unit. Well, you can tell me a story about how that's in the person's self-interest. Oh, you just didn't want to feel guilty the rest of your life, or this person didn't want to feel guilty the rest of their life. That's why they hopped on the grenade. And the happiness they felt was so great, it was self-interest. But the thing to notice is that's a ridiculous story, right? How in the world Is it in the person's interest, no matter how great they might feel about themselves for those 2 or 3 seconds before the grenade goes off, how is it in their self-interest to die? And I think any sane person can say, well, even if I felt pretty guilty, I'd get over it, and the guilt isn't so great I wouldn't live the rest of my life fairly happily. Well, again, how would it be in my interest, how would it be in anybody's interest to hop on a live grenade, face certain death? Well, another thing to notice with strong psychological egoism, the strong psychological egoist says, well, you just do it because you feel good about yourself, or you'd feel guilty if you didn't do it. Well, think about it this way, right? If we were really selfish or self-interested, would we even really feel guilty about not helping, not doing something good? Would we really feel good about doing it, right? A person who is completely self-interested, if they see somebody that needs their $50, they're not going to be, oh, I should help out or I'll feel guilty if I don't. They're going to be like, yeah, stinks for him. I'm going to go to the movies and have a nice dinner after. So the very fact that we would feel guilty or that we feel good for helping seems to show that in a deep sense we're not selfish. If we were truly selfish or self-interested, we just wouldn't care. And beyond that, the fact that the strong psychological egoist can always tell us a story where there's some self-interested reason, we shouldn't be worried about that, right? Look, I can make a lot of ridiculous claims and tell you a story that deals with the evidence against those claims, right? I could tell you that the light goes on and off in my refrigerator because a little man lives in there and turns it on and off. I could tell you that the Loch Ness Monster exists, and no doubt if I made those stupid claims, sorry if you guys are strong, committed believers in Nessie, Loch Ness Monster is not real. It's a couple Scottish kids doing a hoax, it's pretty clear now. But look, you give me evidence against the little man living in my refrigerator, you give me evidence against the Loch Ness Monster, I can always tell some ridiculous story that discounts that evidence, right? I can say, well, yeah, of course we never see him, he's invisible. Or, well, yeah, of course those kids admitted to coming up with a fake model and taking pictures, but there's a model, there's a fake Nessie, and there's a real Nessie, right? It gets to a point, those claims are ridiculous, you can tell me a story, it's not a very good story. The strong psychological egoist, he can tell us a story, oh, people hop on live grenades because they just enjoy being a hero so much that it's worth giving up their life, or they would feel so guilty if they didn't do it that they know it wouldn't be worth living after that. Or you give up your money because you're just so, you enjoy so much helping out, or you would feel so guilty for not that it just wouldn't be worth it. They can tell us those stories, but after a certain point, they get to be pretty ridiculous. They get to be on the level of the man in my refrigerator is invisible, or there's fake Nessie and there's real Nessie, right? So, strong psychological egoism, very interesting if it's true, but if you look at the evidence, I don't think there's any good reason to think that it is true. Okay, so let's stop there, and in the next series of, in the next lecture, in the next video, we'll talk about ethical egoism.